Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. I'm Bob Hathaway. I direct the Asia program here, and we are pleased to be one of the co-sponsors of this event today, but this is a collaborative effort in a number of different ways. In addition to the Asia program, this event is also sponsored by the Division of International Security Studies, headed by Robert Litvak. Rob, you want to raise your hand in the back of the room? Thanks to Rob. It's also co-sponsored by the History and Public Policy program, headed by Christian Osterman. Christian, you want to raise your hand? You're shy, Christian. So it's certainly a collaborative effort among several of us here at the Wilson Center. In addition, thanks to the Los Alamos National Laboratory, which works with Rob's group to sponsor a monthly non-proliferation forum. And Los Alamos is also a sponsor of this and has helped to make this possible. We are going live through the miracle of the Internet. This is being webcast. And so, because there may be some people in our greater audience that are not familiar with the Woodrow Wilson Center, let me simply say that we are the nation's memorial to President Wilson, created by the Congress almost 40 years ago. We see as our purpose trying to provide a bridge between the world of scholars and the world of the policy practitioner. And in this manner, reflecting and commemorating President Wilson's twin passions of scholarship as well as public policy. This year happens to be the 150th anniversary of Woodrow Wilson's birth, and the Wilson Center is marking that event this Friday by a full day of public activities. I would encourage you to look on the website or look on the bulletin board in the lobby downstairs as you came in, those of you who are here in the room today, and pick out a couple of events which look particularly attractive to you and join us this Friday for this full day commemoration. We're here today to help launch a new book looking at President Carter's historic peace mission to North Korea in June 1994, at the height of what has come to be called the first North Korean nuclear crisis. The book's author, Marion Creekmore, was and is a close aide to President Carter and accompanied President Carter on this historic visit 12 years ago. We also have in this room today another participant in that trip, Dick Christensen. See if we can get you to raise your hand. Dick accompanied President Carter and Marion Creekmore as the translator on that visit. And Dick, if after we get through the formal presentation, if you want to share a thought or two with us, we would welcome hearing from you. We are now, as we know, in the midst of another North Korean nuclear crisis. I have to confess that this event was planned well before the nuclear tests several weeks ago. The Wilson Center is not responsible for those nuclear tests, but nonetheless, I can't imagine a more timely moment than now to look back at that earlier crisis a dozen years ago for lessons and guidance. Marion Creekmore is distinguished visiting professor of history and political science at Emory University. Previously, he was program director at the Carter Center, this after a full career as an American diplomat. Dr. Creekmore served as U.S. ambassador to Sri Lanka and the Maldives. He held a number of other senior positions in his State Department career, both here in Washington and overseas, and we are particularly pleased to have him. Following Marion Creekmore's presentation, we will then turn to someone who is well known, certainly to everybody in this room, Don Oberdorfer, who is director of the New Korea Institute at the School for Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University here in town. Don is, I'm pleased to say, a frequent participant in Wilson Center events, and it's always good to have him back. You probably know Don best as the chief diplomatic correspondent for the Washington Post, for whom he wrote for a quarter century. You probably also know Don because of his many books. I think his first book covered the Tet Offensive and was written 35 years ago and is still regularly read and consulted. Those of us who have written books look at that particular record with a great deal of awe. Since then, Don has written on the Cold War. His most recent book is on a biography of Senator Mansfield. And, of course, in terms of the interests of this particular audience, he is the author of the prize-winning The Two Koreas, a Contemporary History. So we will turn to Don for brief comments following Marion's presentation. At the end of our event today, I would invite you to stop at the table immediately to the right of the door as you depart this room, where you'll have an opportunity to buy this book for the astonishingly low price of $25. And then, since Dr. Creekmore has agreed to stay afterwards and indeed to join us in a little bit of refreshments, if you buy said book. My guess is he'll sign said book. Is that a fair promise?
That's a fair promise.
All right. Well, without any further ado, I turn things over to you, Marion.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be with you. I appreciate the Wilson Center allowing me to come and launch the book here. I appreciate all of your presence. I appreciate the sponsors for making this possible. I started off this morning in Atlanta. We had one of the worst traffic jams in Atlanta's history at Hartsfield Airport. It took about an hour and a half to get through security. But I was prepared for that, thank you. I got up in plenty of time and managed that fine. But I'm afraid I kept some of you waiting because it seems to take 25 minutes to get a taxi here in Washington to come to my hotel. And so if you've been here waiting, I apologize for that, but I'm really delighted to be here with you. I'm also delighted to share the time together with Don Oberdorfer, someone I've admired very much, someone who has written, I think, one of the finest books on the Koreas, and one that I consulted very frequently as I tried to put together my book. If we were talking here a year ago, I might have to take a few minutes to remind us of all of just how important the North Korean nuclear weapons program is. But with the missile firing in July and the nuclear weapons test earlier this month, my job is made easier, unfortunately, because we all understand just how important this subject is and just how important this second North Korean missile nuclear weapons crisis is. I think we would all agree that it is a very serious national security issue. It is a hot political subject. Now, I will be prepared, if you would like, at the end, during the questions and answers periods, to talk about the current crisis to the extent that I'm able. I'm sure Don will as well. But I'm going to focus my formal remarks on that first North Korean nuclear weapons crisis, rolling the calendar back for 12 years to 1994. I want to very quickly remind us what led to that crisis, and then try to talk with you about how President Carter, then Citizen Carter, intervened and brought about the breakthrough opening that allowed the Clinton administration and the North Korean government to negotiate the agreed framework of October of 1994, an agreement that held for 8 years. In the early months of 1994, even though the crisis had been building for a couple of years, by those early months, the governments involved had reached a diplomatic gridlock. There were two basic issues. The first issue was how much plutonium North Korea had managed to separate and have in its possession. Now, in 2002, it had admitted to the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna that it had a small amount of plutonium. It claimed to have far less than enough to make one nuclear weapon. But the U.S. and the IAEA and others thought it had more than that. But quite frankly, no one knew for sure how much. The U.S. intelligence estimate in 1994 was that they had enough plutonium to make somewhere between 0 and 2 nuclear weapons. So one of the issues was to try to find out precisely how much plutonium North Korea had in order to try to ensure that that got under safeguards by the IAEA and they did not produce any more. In that particular issue, the U.S. and the IAEA wanted to carry out something called special inspections of a couple of waste sites that they thought if they could investigate those, they would be able to determine just how much plutonium North Korea had. North Korea refused to allow those type of special inspections. The second issue is that North Korea had an operation and had had since 1986 one nuclear reactor. It was a 5-megawatt graphite moderated reactor. And somewhere between 1989 and 1991, it had taken some spent fuel out of that reactor. And as you probably know, with the proper kinds of procedures, plutonium can be separated from the spent fuel. And that's where they got that original plutonium that we were trying to find out how much it was there in the early months of '94. The big issue, however, was that they were about to discharge the spent fuel rods again in 1994. And those spent fuel rods, when they were cooled in the cooling pond, could then be operated on so that somewhere between 5 and 6 nuclear weapons worth of plutonium could be separated by the North Koreans. And so the United States, a number of other countries, and the IAEA wanted to ensure that, one, these fuel rods would stay under international monitoring, and more importantly, we were insisting, or the IAEA was insisting, backed by the U.S. government, that a certain number of those fuel rods, as they were discharged, be segregated, and from that group of fuel rods, about 300 out of the 8,000 to be separated, it was thought one could determine how much plutonium North Korea had. Again, North Korea refused to allow that procedure to take place. And so what happened in those early months of 1994 was that the IAEA threw the issue to the UN Security Council. The United States and other countries, including South Korea, pushed for economic sanctions to come out of the Security Council against North Korea. The U.S. refused to hold bilateral talks with the North Koreans, and we began to rather seriously augment our military forces in and around the Korean Peninsula. North Korea, for its part, declared both publicly and privately that it would interpret Security Council sanctions against it as an act of war and would respond accordingly. And then, in May of 1994, without appropriate warning, it began to discharge these fuel rods into the cooling pond. And that led the U.S. to push very hard for the sanctions, to build up our military forces, and it looked as though diplomacy was over, and it was simply a matter of finding out, would North Korea make good its threat to interpret sanctions by the UN as a declaration of war and respond in some kind of way, probably militarily. The Clinton administration was moving on this strategy and did not intend to have any kind of direct negotiations with the North Koreans until they backed down. This was the situation that Jimmy Carter, Citizen Carter, at the Carter Center in Atlanta, looked at in those early months of 1994. Carter, despite some of his critics, was very knowledgeable about things Korean. If you recall, and Don documents it quite well in his book, he had had a major issue of dealing with South Korea during his term as president. In fact, he had actually had some communications with the president of North Korea, Kim Il-sung, during that same time. Once he left the White House, he kept up with what was going on the Korean Peninsula. Shortly after he left the White House, he went on a trip to China, kind of reinforced those contacts he had with senior Chinese officials, and kept in touch with them throughout the 80s and the 90s, having their read of what was going on in all of Asia, but particularly in North Korea. He was also supplied a good many reports by his own staff, a lot of information by a number of non-governmental organizations, information by officials of the U.S. government, the South Korean government, the Japanese government, and others. And so he was following this situation very closely with a lot of knowledge. Beginning in 1991, Kim Il-sung had begun to invite Carter to come and pay a visit to North Korea, inviting him to help improve relations between the U.S. and North Korea, as well as between the North Korea and South Korea. And on 3 occasions, in 1991, 1992, and 1993, Carter, at the explicit request, first of the George H.W. Bush administration and then the Bill Clinton administration, Carter had turned down those invitations to go to North Korea. But as the months of 1994 ticked away, and as Carter became increasingly convinced that something had to change the dynamics of the diplomacy or there was a real chance of war, he decided he would have to do something. And in fact, he decided he would do what he had never done before since leaving the White House. And that is, he would go to North Korea even if the Clinton administration asked him not to do so. Fortunately, at the last minute, the administration reluctantly acquiesced to his going as a representative, as a private citizen representing the Carter Center, not as an emissary of the U.S. government. Now let me tell you why Carter thought somebody needed to go. First, he believed someone needed to talk to the one person in North Korea who would determine whether or not that threat to treat sanctions as a declaration of war would be real or not. There was only one man who could make that decision, and that man was Kim Il-sung, the president of North Korea, the man who had led that country to independence in the late 1940s, who had been its president ever since that time, who had achieved his goal in a ruthless manner, but at the same time won almost deity-like status among his people. And it was Carter's view that before you took steps that just might lead to war, somebody ought to talk face to face with Kim Il-sung. His preference would have been for some senior official of the U.S. administration, like the Secretary of State. But it had been determined, and it was reaffirmed to Carter when Bob Gallucci came down to Plains on June 6, 1994, that there was no intention of talking directly to Kim Il-sung. In fact, Gallucci admitted that when the U.S. put messages to the North Korean mission in New York, it was kind of a tube problem. We put a message in the tube at the UN in New York, or in the mission in New York, without any knowledge of what came out of the other end of the tube. We had no idea whether or not they were delivering the message to the policymakers in North Korea as we had said them, or whether they were kind of buffing them up a little bit. We didn't even know if the messages were actually getting to Kim Il-sung. So Carter believed somebody has got to go and talk to Kim Il-sung, and if no official U.S. representative would do so, perhaps because he had those invitations, had been a former president, perhaps he should go. And so he decided to go. There was another thing on Carter's mind. Carter, in his briefings in Plains by Gallucci and also in Washington a few days later, understood that there were a number of things the U.S. was prepared to do in terms of putting together a negotiating package. But up until that time, the basic posture had largely been that the North Koreans had to do what we wanted them to do on the nuclear side, and then we would talk with them seriously about what we might be able to do to meet some of their concerns. Carter believed that the only way to have any kind of successful negotiation was that both sides had to get benefits and obligations that came more or less simultaneously. And so after his briefings in Washington, he put together a package proposal which really contained things that the U.S. government was prepared to do. Many of those items had kind of been hinted to the North Koreans before, but had never been put together in a package kind of, you do this and we'll do that and this is what we're going to do. It dealt specifically with the North Koreans' concerns about their own external security and the internal security of the regime, about economic assistance, about political isolation in the sense that there could be talks that might lead to diplomatic relations in the future. But Carter wrote out that package agreement before he left, and the interesting thing is that the deal he and Kim Il-sung struck came very close to that document that Carter produced in Plains, Georgia, before we went to the Korean Peninsula. The third thing that Carter believed was that in dealing with the North Koreans, as in dealing with anyone else, you should be dealing with in an atmosphere of friendship and with respect toward your interlocutors. He simply did not believe hurling insults across the airways and sharp barbs across the negotiating table was the way to try to frame a mutually acceptable agreement. So with those three ideas in mind, and since no one else was prepared to go, Carter decided that he would go. And so on June 12th, if that's the Sunday, and I think it is, we left Atlanta and flew to South Korea, where we met Dick Christensen, who had been chosen to go with us as our interpreter, as well as advisor. And Dick is a superb interpreter, but he's also an absolutely superb advisor. And the Carters gained a great deal by having him on that. And they still talk very highly of him, including at a session we had at the Carter Center on Tuesday night of last week. So we went to South Korea, where the government really did not want Carter to go across to North Korea. But we got briefings, and then on June 15th, our small party crossed the DMZ, the demilitarized zone, the most heavily armed frontier in the world. And when we came back across on Saturday, as Carter likes to say, we became the first non-Koreans to go across the DMZ both ways since the end of the Korean War. The North Koreans were invariably gracious, but they were tough. Our first meeting, Carter's first meeting, was with the Foreign Minister, Kim Yong-nam. Very polite in terms of social ideas, but very tough on the political side. He made it very clear to Carter that North Korea was the wronged party on every single issue, that the United States was to blame for all the problems, that North Korea fully intended, as they had announced the day we arrived in South Korea, to expel all the IAEA inspectors from the country, and they would clearly, and were prepared to move expeditiously, treat that UN resolution, should it be passed, as a declaration of war. No give. Carter made a number of suggestions of things North Korea might do to try to tampen down the crisis. No give whatsoever. And then the foreign minister said, now we must go be entertained, and so we'll go and have a nice dinner. And we did. But as Dick and I were tasked by Carter to do a memcon of that particular conversation, and I want to thank Dick publicly, I've thanked him privately, I was absolutely exhausted from jet lag. And so Dick wrote the first draft, woke me up. I might have made two little changes, and then we slid it under Carter's door at 1 a.m. on Thursday morning. 2 hours later, somebody was banging on my door. And there stood Carter in his pajamas saying, get your clothes on, we're going to talk in the garden. All of us expected or assumed that the rooms were bugged, and so I quickly put on my clothes, and for 2 hours, and what must have been several miles, President Carter, Mrs. Carter, and I walked in the garden deciding what to do. Carter was quite discouraged because he believed that if his meeting the next morning with Kim Il-sung was just as tough as the one had been with the foreign minister, then his mission would fail, the sanctions resolution would go forward, and he was convinced that war would happen. And so he decided, he really became, I think, through to him at that point more than any time before. He had absolutely no authority to do anything but listen. And he was really very concerned about that. He thought the IAEA inspectors would be thrown out. They had certainly said they were going to do. If they did that, then the chain of surveillance would be lost. There would be no way to know what they were going to do with those spent fuel rods. And so Carter wanted to send a message to Clinton saying, I really need you to authorize me to say that if they keep the IAEA inspectors, we will that is, the U.S. will take up a bilateral dialogue with North Korea. Now, that was something the U.S. government was absolutely not going to do. And so as we talked about it, we realized that if we sent that letter, it would probably get a negative reaction in Washington. But Carter wanted to go ahead and write the letter and have it ready to go if his meeting with Kim Il-sung turned out to be a poor one. You know, there was always, and we knew this as we walked in that garden, there was always a chance that we were being subjected to a bad cop, good cop routine, that the foreign minister was going to beat up on us, and then the president would step back and try to cut a deal. So what Carter decided to do was to write the letter, send me back across the DMZ with the letter, holding it so I could send it from the South Korean side where we had secure communications facilities. But I was instructed not to send it until Dick Christensen called me. And Dick would call me after the meeting with Kim Il-sung to tell me, send the message, or don't send the message, come back to the capital of North Korea. Fortunately, the latter scenario played out, and Dick called me, and I came back, and the message was not sent. And that is because very early in the meeting with Kim Il-sung, it became very clear that he was looking for a peaceful way out of the crisis. And the portion of my book that really kind of sits you at the negotiating table with a fairly long description of that conversation is drawn directly from Dick Christensen's notes. He was in the meeting, I was not. But you've got details like when Kim Il-sung lights up a cigarette, what he asked of his staff as he's going through these negotiations. Carter's interpretation, Dick's interpretation was that Kim Il-sung was very knowledgeable about the basic issues involved. There were some details that he probably needed some help on, but he was very knowledgeable. And at the end of that conversation, he had agreed that he would freeze the entire nuclear program of North Korea for the duration of good faith talks between the United States and North Korea. That he would leave the IAEA inspectors there, that North Korea would dismantle and scrap all of its nuclear weapons, all of its nuclear program that was graphite moderated, if someone from the outside would provide it with less proliferation-prone light water reactors, and in the end, South Korea and Japan agreed to finance that. He also said that he would agree to work on a regional pact for denuclearizing the entire Korean peninsula. In return, in addition to the light water reactors, he wanted economic assistance because the economy was very weak and just beginning to go through an extremely bad patch that lasted throughout the mid-90s. He wanted political talks that might lead to diplomatic relations someday with the United States. And he wanted a pledge that the United States would not attack North Korea with nuclear weapons. Now, Carter made it very clear he could not sign anything for the U.S. government, but he could take that back to President Clinton, and Carter said in his own personal view, he thought that would end the crisis. That meeting occurred the morning of June 16, 1994, Korean time. That afternoon, Dick and the Carters went into the meeting, and I got in late coming back from across the DMZ. And that was a very interesting meeting because that was with the nuclear negotiator, the person that Bob Gallucci faced off with in 1993 and then subsequently in the negotiation of the agreed framework, a man by the name of Kang Sok-ju. And he spent about 2 hours desperately trying to walk back the concessions that his president had given to President Carter. And I must confess, Carter has, when he wants, he can be an impatient man, but when he wants to show patience, he's very good at it. He simply would sit there and listen to this bureaucrat, senior bureaucrat, but really giving totally different interpretations than what his president had done. And in the end, President Carter would say, now I understand that, Mr. Kong, do you mean that you're taking a position different from your great leader? Great leader is what all the North Koreans call Kim Il-sung. And it was amazing how fast that he could do 180 degrees and say, no, that's not what I mean. What you said is exactly right. Now let's move on to the next issue. And then he'd do it again. And so for about 2 hours, there was this parry and thrust going on. But in the end, Carter said, look, I've got the agreement of your president. I'm going to call Washington and report on this. And then I'm going to go on CNN and tell the world about our agreement. The next morning, while we were on a presidential cruise, which itself was extraordinary, it's something that very seldom happened, Carter certainly was not expecting it, that is a presidential cruise with Kim Il-sung. I think we were probably out there about 3 hours or more. During that, they reaffirmed the agreement that they had established. They also, Kim Il-sung also said that he would be happy to attend a Korean summit meeting with Kim Jong-sam, the president of South Korea, and that he would allow Americans and North Korean troops to search together for the remains of Americans killed in the Korean War and buried somewhere in North Korea. And so the next morning, on Saturday, we came back across the DMZ, fully expecting that we had, or at least that Carter had, laid the path to a peaceful resolution. And we found, rather than meeting triumph and praise, we were subjected to terrible rancor. And that's because of two things that occurred during the Carter trip in North Korea. The first of these was the CNN interview on Thursday evening. Carter called Bob Gallucci, who was in a meeting with the president and the top national security people in the White House, talking about how to press the sanctions forward in the UN and how large to augment the latest thrust in terms of building up our military. And it's at that time that Carter's call came in, and Gallucci asking, I'm told that President Clinton was about to go out to take the call, and the secretary said, no, he's asking for Mr. Gallucci. So Bob Gallucci went out and took the call. And at that point, Carter outlined for Gallucci the agreement he had. He said he was going on CNN. Bob did not say, don't go on CNN, and took a scolding, as Don points out in his book, when he got back in with his colleagues. And then Carter, having been told that his views would be considered, decided to go ahead and do the CNN interview that he had scheduled, which he did, and he laid out to the world the agreement he had reached with Kim Il-sung. He's very careful in that interview, and the book has a good bit of that in it, but he's very careful to say, I can't make the decision. It is President Clinton who will have to decide if this is an agreement the U.S. will sign on to. But as a personal recommendation, I will recommend that he sign on to that agreement. But as Don describes so vividly, as does Bob Gallucci and Dan Poneman and Joel Witt in their book on this whole thing, it was very frustrating for the administration to sit in front of the television and watch President Carter telling from North Korea what he had agreed with Kim Il-sung. They obviously expected him, thought he should, even though he was not an emissary. He was a private citizen. He was representing the Carter Center, but they fully expected he should have come back and talked to them and let them decide how to react publicly to what was done. That was not what Carter did. So that led to a great deal of consternation. It actually led to the administration ratcheting upward the ante, in the sense that Tony Lake called Carter over an open line while we were in North Korea and insisted that the freeze had to contain explicit no reprocessing and no refueling of the reactor. No reprocessing of the fuel, no refueling of the reactor. Neither of these things had been briefed to us in Washington before we went over. The other thing that Carter did that set the administration on edge was on Friday morning in the presidential yacht, He and Mrs. Carter were meeting with President and Mrs. Kim, and for just a few moments, there were media people present, including CNN. And Carter made a statement that the U.S., on the basis of the agreement that had been reached, the U.S. had stopped the sanctions activity in the UN. Now, what Carter meant to say was that because of the agreement that we've reached, it is my view that the U.S. will stop the sanctions move in the UN. But that's not what he said. The sound bite, when we saw it, when we got back into South Korea, was very clear. And so, even though Carter had been careful in all of his meetings to make the point, what came across was a former president telling the president of North Korea that the U.S. government had changed its policy in the UN when in fact it hadn't. And so President Clinton and a number of people went on television and made that very clear. Carter was called a lot of things by certain members of the administration, and Don's got some of that, and I've got some of that, and Joel and Bob and Dan have some of that. And so when we came back across the DMZ, it was not a triumphal reentry. Jim Laney, the U.S. ambassador in South Korea, had the unenviable task of telling Carter, one, that Washington was mad, and two, here's to a man who thought he had stopped the war from happening. He was told, don't bother to come to Washington. You just go back to Plains, Georgia, and sometime in the next couple of weeks, we'll send somebody down to get your report. Carter has something of a temper, and according to Laney, he had never seen him so mad. But when we got back to the embassy residence, he got on a secure phone with Al Gore, and the two of them talked the issue through. And in the end, Gore says that if the North Koreans mean by their freeze that they will not refuel, and they will not reprocess, and they will indeed let the IAEA inspectors stay, and they will confirm this in diplomatic channels, so we're getting it officially through our channels and not just you're coming back and telling us, then we have a breakthrough. And Carter said, well, I can tell you that's exactly what you're going to get, but I agree it should come through diplomatic channels. He also said, I really would like to come by Washington and give you a further debrief. And so after that conversation, it was agreed that Carter would go to Washington. When he got there, he was somewhat disappointed that President Clinton wasn't there, Vice President Gore wasn't there, Secretary of State Christopher wasn't there. Tony Lake ran the meeting, and Bob Gallucci was there, and 2 or 3 other people. And they had a good meeting in which they basically agreed we've got to come together on this, because what the newspapers were doing at the time was exploiting the differences between the Clinton administration and the Carter team rather than talking about what had actually been done substantively. There's a lot in the book about that, and I'll be happy to go into it more if you're interested in the question and answer period. But after about 3 days, the North Koreans came back with a diplomatic note that explicitly agreed to everything Carter said they would agree to, and that included everything the U.S. government in the diplomatic note that it had sent beforehand had asked for. And so the Clinton administration very quickly seized on the initiative, set up meetings, and with brilliant negotiating by Bob Gallucci and others, and very strong and good support back here in Washington, in less than 4 months, the agreed framework was negotiated and signed. And under that agreed framework, as you know, the North Koreans' nuclear weapons program that was plutonium-based was frozen, and all of those other provisions that I mentioned, plus some additional ones, were agreed, and that was signed in October of 1994. Now, if you would like, in the question and answer period, we can go into the specific terms, and we can deal with this whole issue that's become a political debate about whether or not the agreed framework was a good agreement or not. Let me just at this point say the scorecard is simply this. Between 1994 and December of 2002, when the agreement collapsed with fault on both sides, North Korea did not produce any plutonium. Between January of 2003 and today, most experts believe they have produced somewhere between 6 and 10 nuclear weapons worth of plutonium. And if the agreed framework had been in effect this month, I think it's highly unlikely that there would have been or even could have been a North Korean nuclear weapons test. Let me conclude at this point with my remarks by quoting two sentences from the last paragraph of the epilogue of my book. Quote, "I have written this book because of my conviction that Jimmy Carter's quest for peace in 1994 made the world safer and probably prevented a war that was neither necessary nor desired. It is my hope that those in the future dealing with North Korea will reflect seriously upon the experiences and approach of President Carter, even if their own political philosophy differs significantly from his. That remains my hope, though not my expectation." Thank you very much.
We're going to run the rest of this program quite informally and simply sit rather than stand. I now turn things over to Don.
Okay, is this working all right? Everybody can hear me? Fine, good. It's a splendid book. I highly recommend it. As Marion said, I was in touch with the members of his team after this issue was joined, and I followed it, and I had at least some access to some of the things that Marion had when writing this book, but I didn't have access to nearly all the things from Jimmy Carter, from his diary, from various reminiscences of him and of Marion's own bird's eye view on the situation. So he has added a lot to what we knew about this mission. It has a lot of relevance to today, particularly that last statement that you made about your hopes and your expectations. You know, there's so much in this situation, as to use the old Yogi Berra phrase, deja vu all over again. Here we're going into a very serious crisis. Things are in one sense, they're much worse than they were in 1994. We're talking about, in 1994, the potential unloading of a 5-megawatt reactor, the potential manufacture of some plutonium. Now, as Marion just explained, they have manufactured a lot of plutonium. They've actually had a nuclear weapons test. They have tested long-range ballistic missiles, or at least longer-range ballistic missiles. And in many ways, the situation has advanced not to the advantage of peace, but at the same time, in a sense, things seem less dangerous than they were in 1994. In 1994, there was an option, a military option. The United States could have, at great risk, taken out the nuclear facilities of North Korea with a couple of cruise missiles or even gravity bombs. That is no longer an option because their nuclear materials and, to some degree, nuclear facilities are not out in the open for anyone to do. Today, as in 1994, this crisis is building up, and nobody has been to see the leader of North Korea from the American side. There was a dialogue going with him with Secretary Albright at the end of the Clinton administration. And he proved then, as he has, as far as I know, in every encounter he's ever had with a high-ranking outsider, to be more flexible than anyone anticipated. This was the case with Japanese Prime Minister Koizumi. It was the case with Secretary Albright. It was the case with, I don't know about the Chinese emissary of last week, but it's quite conceivable. Some of the reports suggest it was the case then. It was the case with South Korean Minister of Unification Chung Dong-young, who saw him in June of last year. To me, it is just absurd that you go into a major crisis like this and you will not talk to the person on the other side who has the authority to turn this into something other than a military showdown. I had my own experience with this. Assistant Secretary of State Jim Kelly went to Pyongyang in October of 2002 to tell the North Koreans that the United States government had learned that they were pursuing a secret program to produce nuclear weapons using highly enriched uranium, a different method than the plutonium method, which has been talked about here this afternoon. The North Koreans wanted to talk about it, but Kelly's instructions were to tell them this and leave, which he did. Exactly 1 month later, former ambassador to South Korea, Donald Gregg, and I went to Pyongyang. We saw exactly the same people that Kelly had seen, including Kang Suk-ju, the man that Marion talked about, who tried to roll it back for Kim Il-sung. And they gave us a written message from Kim Jong-il to President Bush, and they only asked that we not make it public until after the president, that is to say President Bush, had received it. We brought it back. We took it to the White House. We said nothing about getting such a message in our press conferences in Seoul and elsewhere. We brought it back and we gave it to Stephen Hadley, who was at that time the Deputy National Security Advisor. Condoleezza Rice was the National Security Advisor. And we took it to the State Department and gave it to Richard Armitage, both in Korean, which is where we were given it, and in a translation that we had gotten. I'm just going to read you this message. It says, at a time when, this is from Kim Jong-il to President Bush. Am I doing something wrong? Is this thing falling off or something? Yeah, sorry. It fell off and I didn't even know it. Yeah, the message. Well, I don't know. I'm going to put it up here. It doesn't seem to want to stick on my tie, so maybe it'll stick on this. Yeah. Now, is it working? Okay, sorry. Here's the message from Kim Jong-il to President Bush. At a time when positive changes are taking place in the region of northeastern Asia, we hope a new chapter will also open, overcoming the current crisis in the bilateral relationship between the DPRK and the United States. We believe that the current nuclear issue was generated essentially from the U.S. hostile policy of disregarding our sovereignty and of imposing blatant military threat. If the United States recognizes our sovereignty and assures non-aggression, it is our view that we should be able to find a way to resolve the nuclear issue in compliance with the demand of a new century. Taking note of President Bush's statement that the United States has no intention to invade, we deem it important that the United States provide a legal guarantee of non-aggression. If the United States makes a bold decision, we will respond accordingly. We told Hadley that if this was the contents of a railroad timetable to Poughkeepsie, you can answer it. You got a message from the only guy in North Korea who has any authority over these things. So you could send back whatever message you think is appropriate and join this conversation with him. But Steve Hadley told us that would be rewarding bad behavior. In effect, they didn't want to talk to Kim Jong-il. Some, I don't know about Mr. Hadley, but some in the administration simply wanted to bring down North Korea. Whether you think that is possible or not is up to you. At any rate, to me, I mean, we need another Jimmy Carter. It can't be, I don't think, this Jimmy Carter, not in this administration, but you need somebody who's willing to take enough of a political risk, as what Jimmy Carter did, to go to North Korea with the approval of the administration, if possible, and defuse this thing. Otherwise, we're going down the same road as we did in the first nuclear crisis. And I don't think Marion, in his conversation, gave you enough of a sense of how dangerous this was. At the moment that President Carter was in Pyongyang talking to Kim Il-sung, President Clinton was back here talking to his national security advisors, and they were laying out how many American troops and planes and tanks and ships were going to go into the waters and land around South Korea in order to ensure that if the North Koreans meant it, that sanctions are equivalent to war, the United States would be ready. And everybody knew at that time, the United States had no idea how the North Koreans were actually going to react when they saw this flotilla of aircraft carriers and warplanes and additional troops flying into South Korea at this moment of high tension. An estimate was given to President Clinton by the Pentagon, drawn up by General Luck, who was the Supreme Commander in Korea. He estimated, on the basis of experience in Vietnam and the Persian Gulf, that due to the colossal lethality of modern weapons in the urban environment of Korea, as many as 1 million people would be killed in the resumption of a full-scale war on the Korean Peninsula, including 80,000 to 100,000 Americans. That the out-of-pocket costs to the United States would exceed $100 billion, and that the destruction of property and interruption of business activity would cost more than $1 trillion to the countries involved and their immediate neighbors. It's interesting that when President Bush, this President Bush, met Kim Dae-jung in Korea, they first had a rather bad meeting in Washington. And then Bush went to Korea as part of some international meetings. He met Kim Dae-jung. And Kim Dae-jung recited to him the estimates of what death and destruction would come if there was another war on the Korean Peninsula. For the first, I won't say only, it's one of the very few times in the Bush presidency, he walked out of that meeting and he said something extremely important that was not in any talking points. It was not in his briefing, it was not in his talking points, It was something he said because he had heard what Kim Dae-jung had told him. He stated, the United States has no intention of attacking North Korea. And actually that statement has been used ever since by American diplomats. Because the president finally realized, you know, we're talking about something here that not only could destroy what people have built, it could destroy huge numbers of people. It could destroy his presidency as well. Well, I'm talking about today, but let me go back to say that the book is fascinating. You'll learn a lot. I learned things from the book that I didn't know, and I probably know more about it than the average person on the street.
No more than I did.
One of the things that Marion doesn't mention much about in the book, but I found particularly interesting in the Carter visit, and I only touch on it slightly actually in my book. We don't know much about how North Korean decisions are made because it's a country that's closed off to the world. It's very opaque, to put it mildly, as far as their decision making is concerned. But there was an incident during this visit. Marion has mentioned the U.S. desire that the International Atomic Energy inspectors remain in Korea. The North Koreans had announced they were going to kick them out because the North Koreans had announced they were leaving the pact, the anti-nuclear pact on which these people are based. So Carter, at the request of Washington, asked Kim Il-sung during their meeting, please let the inspectors remain. And according to an account which I got, and if there's anybody here that can throw any further light on it, I'd be happy to hear it. Kim Il-sung says something like, what is this issue all about? He says to Kang Suk-ju, who's the only substantial aide of substance who's with him, and who was the only one with, by the way, with Kim Jong-il when he met with Secretary Albright. He didn't know what they're talking about. And Kang Suk-ju explains it to him, that we've said that we are leaving the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and these people are here, have been inspecting, and we said we're kicking them out. And President Carter is asking you to let them stay. Whereupon Kim Il-sung says, would it be greatly to our disadvantage if we let them stay? And Kang Suk-ju says, no, sir, I don't believe that it would be to our disadvantage. Whereupon Kim Il-sung didn't summon a meeting. He didn't ask to think it over. He just turned to Jimmy Carter. He said, they will stay. That's how decisions are made in North Korea. At the top. And the U.S. reluctance to engage with the only person who can make those kind of decisions, to me, I find it incredible and dangerous. So I thank Marion for his book. I thank former President Carter for giving us a way out of what looked like an extraordinarily dangerous situation in 1994. There are people who believe that Kim Il-sung would have found a way to get out of this in some other way, but no one can know that. I don't know whether it's true or not, and we'll never know. It's ahistoric. The fact is the matter, the U.S. didn't have to send those planes and aircraft carriers and troops, which might have caused the North Koreans who are paranoid, to say, we're going to take action before these people could get here. Thank goodness it didn't happen that way. But we have a good record now of what did happen. a much better record than we've ever had before, and I commend the book to you. It's a very good read.
Thank you.
Well, thanks to both Marion and Don for really two wonderful presentations. We have a lot of talent in this audience. We have a lot of people with extensive experience in Korea. As I indicated a minute ago, I'm going to see if Dick Christensen would like to make a brief comment. But Dick, even before we turn to you, I'm going to ask Marion a question myself. Marion, Kim Il-sung, a man whom, for better or for worse, ran North Korea for almost half a century, started a war, a war which became a major war involving the United States. And yet, over that entire period of time he was in power, relatively few Americans ever met him. I think he remained, up until the day he died, a cipher for the United States. What were your impressions of Kim Il-sung?
First, I sat in with the Carters, and Kim Il-sung and his wife on the Friday cruise, and we were together a lot of time. That was a very interesting conversation because the four had become very good friends, or all impressions of being very good friends, after just the one meeting before. So it was a very relaxed conversation. They joked a good bit. Mrs. Kim said that she was a much better shot than her husband. Kim Il-sung told Carter that there were trout here, and he'd like to have some Americans come over and fish trout. And Carter says, you know, now we're getting to serious business. But they talked about the issues of the summit. They talked about the issues that they had agreed on the day before. They talked about the missing in action, getting the remains. And they did so in such a way that, first, Kim Il-sung was very knowledgeable, and yet at the same time he was sufficiently self-confident. When he didn't know something, he was quite willing to say so. In fact, he would make fun about he had to turn to Kang Sok-ju anytime there was a nuclear issue. Well, Dick had reported before that that was not the case. The point that Don made, I think Dick would concur in that from my read of his notes. Yes, he made that decision on the spot. He was personable, he was enjoyable to be with, and yet he was a man who had caused a tremendous amount of death in the Korean War, and had presumably made decisions to do some terrible things in the course of that 40-some-odd years. But Mike Chinoy once said that in his book that he almost comes across as an uncle-like figure that you really like. And I enjoyed talking with him, enjoyed being with him. I had no doubt, however, that when he made a decision, if you were a North Korean, you did not cross that decision. The only other thing I just elaborate on in terms of my statement earlier, that he had an almost deity-like quality there. We were taken to a lot of cultural events. Everyone opened with a pledge of allegiance to Kim Il-sung. Many of the songs talked about the North Korea, which is the best country in the world, and Kim Il-sung, who is leading us on. There was no doubt in my mind, and maybe I'm stating it too strongly, but because I was only there 3 days, but there was no doubt in my mind that if Kim Il-sung ordered the North Koreans to go to war in June of 1994, they would have gone, and they would have gone willingly. In fact, if I can just make a point here that's only peripherally connected, Jim Laney and a number of his people, or a number of the American military up on the DMZ in those months, heard from many different sources the following. We watched you pull together all of those troops for Desert Storm before you attacked Iraq and Kuwait. We are not going to let you do that to us before we do something militarily. And so I believe that Kim Il-sung had the power to move that country in that direction if he decided that was what he wanted to do. But at the same time, I felt that he was a man who looked at the world, looked at the situation, wanted a peaceful way out, wanted to take care of his interest, and found a man in Jimmy Carter whom he could talk to, and they might be able to work that out. And I think they did, and I commend the Clinton administration for moving very quickly once we got over the little diatribe we had when we got back, and moving forward to the agreed framework. One last story. Carter got a note. Carter sent a sympathy note right after Kim Il-sung died. As you may know, Kim Il-sung died less than 3 weeks after we left North Korea. Carter sent a sympathy note. He received a letter back from Kim Jong-il saying, I will honor every agreement my father made with you. And he did.
Dick, I put you on the spot, but would you care to offer anything? If we can get Dick a microphone.
Sure, I'd be happy to speak briefly.
Wait till we get you a microphone, Dick. Got one coming the other way.
No? Oh, good, a dead one.
Boom, boom, boom. Yeah, I'll speak briefly. I should say first, I'm still with the State Department, but my current don't have involved at all in Korea, so I'm not able or competent to comment now. But a couple comments. First, on your rendering of the discussion over inspectors between Kang Suk-ju and Kim Il-sung is correct. Kim Il-sung, on being informed about this, asked one or two questions to clarify, but then made his decision on the spot. So you're right. And the thing that's striking about that was that he made the decision. People disputed whether Kim Il-sung really knew what was going on. He demonstrated a very good grasp of the basic fundamental issues. He had the structure of this issue and this crisis well in hand. He didn't have all the details, and that's what was shown by this. But on being told about it, he made a decision. And this whole interchange between he and Kang Suk-ju didn't take more than a minute or two. Something else I just wanted to mention related to that. Striking thing between the morning session with Kim Il-sung and the afternoon session with Kang Suk-ju was the rollback effort. Yes, and I think Marion really documents that beautifully. When Marion and the Carter Company returned to Washington, I stayed a few days in Seoul to consult and to write up my notes. And I recall at the time worrying a little bit that the agreement that had been reached was very clear, but was also very conceptual. And, you know, they say the devil's in the details. And my fear was that when we actually did get to sitting down, that we might find ourselves disagreeing on what some of those conceptual agreements actually meant. And I think I maybe wrote that into one of my cables, just a cautionary note. It wasn't that there was necessarily bad faith, but that there was a huge difference between the conceptual agreement and the enormity of details that would have to be agreed on in an actual agreement. But what struck me and others, I mean everybody who was involved in this, because I did go back and work on this in Washington, everybody who was involved at the time was struck how promises were kept. And it was classical CBM, you know, in the diplomatic sense, confidence building measure process, where you start with a very simple, small promise, and you're both kind of surprised to see you both kept it, and so then you move on to a slightly larger, slightly harder promise, and so it went. But the keeping of promises, it was quite remarkable. I think also, as I recall, North Korea was very reluctant to make promises, and they resisted a lot of things that we tried to agree upon in that negotiation in the fall of '94. But what they agreed to, they kept. Now, the highly enriched uranium program, that turned the page to a new chapter, and the handling of that is something I won't comment on now. And the HU program was a problem. I mean, there's not any question about that. But what struck me was having once made this conceptual agreement, Kim Il-sung's conceptual agreement was faithfully kept. On Kim Il-sung, I would just make a few comments. He was avuncular. Remember, we talked. He had an old man's gait and kind of a smiling way, and he was avuncular. Didn't seem like the guy who would launch an awful war. And sometimes, but in one of the sessions that you weren't at, where once or twice when someone didn't seem to get something right or something, he'd cast a sideways glance and ask a sharp question, and people literally trembled. So he was a pretty stern uncle at sometimes. And he was godlike. At the end of that boat ride, you'll recall, when they were displaying what they called the barrage, the gates of a series of dams at the end of the Nampo, at the end of the Taetong River where it met Nampo. Some girls came up, high school girls it looked like, in traditional garb, with flowers to give him. And they were literally just trembling. They were barely able to contain themselves. And I remember you read old literature, they talk of swooning. And for the first time in my life, I think I saw what a swoon was like, because these girls in the presence of Kim Il-sung were almost on the point of a swoon. So it was an unusual thing indeed. But I'd make those few comments, and thanks for the chance to say them.
Thanks, Dick. I've actually tried to get my staff to swoon before my presentation. I can't do it. I'd like to open it up now to those of you in the audience. I would ask you to wait until we can get a microphone to you, to identify yourself and to keep your comments or your questions brief. We'll start with Joe Snyder down here.
Thank you. This is a question for either Marion or Don. And
Joe, you want to introduce yourself?
I'm sorry, Joe Snyder with the Asia Society. It's an opportunity to ask a hypothetical question, perhaps of Don, the kind of questions that he used to ask when I was a State Department spokesman.
Don't ask me that kind, please.
In spite of Marion's talk about how Kim Jong-il kept Kim Il-sung's promises, I just wonder if either of you would care to speculate on whether the course of the last 12 years would have been any different if Kim Il-sung had not died 3 weeks later.
Of course, we don't know, but it is true, as Marion said, that the basic deal, which was made by President Carter and Kim Il-sung, was the one that really underlay the agreed framework. The agreed framework is simply an elaboration and ratification of the deal that they made, which was he wanted some more modern nuclear reactors, which, by the way, are less susceptible for producing plutonium. And in the end, they also asked for some heavy fuel oil to make up for the energy that they lost, in theory, by shutting down the 5-megawatt reactor that they had. And the other parts of it, having to do with mutual recognition and so on, were all in there, but they weren't pursued. But the deal was the deal that Jimmy Carter made with Kim Il-sung. Now, as things began to get worse and fall apart, would he have done something differently than Kim Jong-il has done? I don't know. I think the key question would be, would he have accepted the offer by A.Q. Khan and Pakistan to create a different kind of a nuclear weapons program really in violation of the spirit of the deal that was made with the United States, if not the letter, in violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, in violation of their agreement with South Korea? Would he have said, I don't think we should do that? We don't know the answer to that question. So I don't know. What do you think, Mayor?
Let me try to answer as the way I think Jimmy Carter would answer you, because he was extremely disappointed when Kim Il-sung died. He believed after his visit that with Kim Il-sung there would be a Geneva agreement, and he believed there would be a summit meeting between North and South Korea. And indeed, there was the preparatory meeting in early July, and the summit would have taken place. It was either from July 25 to 27 or 27 to 29. When he died, then the South Korean government did some things that the North Korean government didn't like, and so that whole summit got put off until 2000. Carter really expected both of those things to happen. He also thought that he had established a relationship with Kim Il-sung that if either Washington or Seoul had major problems in trying to work through problems with the North, that Jimmy Carter, could kind of play a middle role. Now, he has written to Kim Jong-il, but he doesn't have anywhere near the kind of rapport and relationship that was built with the father. So I think the situation would have been better had Kim Il-sung lived. Of course, as Don points out, we can't say for sure. What might have happened with individual incidents is really hard to say. But I know that Carter felt that it was a great loss, not only to North Korea, but to U.S.-North Korean relations, South Korean-North Korean relations when Kim Il-sung died, because he believed that Kim Il-sung saw it in North Korea's interest to significantly improve relations with the U.S. and to significantly improve relations with South Korea.
Joe? Wait till we get a microphone.
Joe Winder. Thank you, Marianne, for your good
Great
work.
to see you.
Nice to see you again. Could you talk a little bit about the no hostile intent aspect of the proposal that President Carter submitted back to Washington? You know, this notion of mutual respect, sovereignty, diplomatic relations that so seems to stick in the craw of the Bush administration, and which was a part of the Chomonok communique, that phrase, no hostile intent, which the Bush administration explicitly refused to reaffirm. That was part of the slippery slope down the hill.
I'm sorry, no hostile intent was
That's right, no hostile intent of the United States toward North Korea. We would demonstrate that in some fashion. What was President Carter's expectation of that concept? What did he put in the proposal that he put together? How did he see the agreed framework having manifested itself to deal with that concern of the North Koreans? Because as I say, this is such a philosophical problem for the Bush administration.
Well, the same complaints that we hear today, we heard in 1994, and sometimes by the same people. I mean, there was a big issue when we came back. A lot of people were really criticizing everything Carter had done and everything he said, because he was sitting down with the dictator, he was talking with bad people, he was saying that we had to be concerned about their concern for their own security. And from Carter's point of view, there was no question, if we were going to cut a deal with North Korea and get what we wanted on the nuclear front, they were going to have to get something on some of the things that really were important to them. And as Don pointed out, they certainly are and were paranoid, and they really thought in 1994, and probably do today, that the U.S. intends to attack, and that the U.S. is absolutely committed to bringing about regime change. And they wanted some satisfaction on that. And what Kim Il-sung wanted was a pledge by the United States that we would not attack and we would not use nuclear weapons against them. Now, from Carter's point of view, from my point of view, that's not hard to give. But I do know that creates a great deal of problems with others. You know, as I look at it in terms of cost to the United States, whether we're dealing with 1994 or today, if we, as part of getting what we want on the nuclear side, and I must say I'm not absolutely certain we can get it today. There's been a lot of water under that bridge. But if it cost us to say we will not attack North Korea, and other countries will not either, we'll provide some economic assistance, we'll talk about diplomatic relations, boy, I think that's a real bargain. And people who disagree with that, I guess we just have to agree to disagree, because I don't see that as appeasement. I mean, you know, throughout the Cold War, we talked with the Soviet Union. I can't see where it's appeasement for the United States to talk to a country the size of Mississippi with 22 million population. You know, I don't see that as a slippery slope. And so I basically just disagree with the people who say that somehow we can't talk with these people. I don't know if that answers your question, Joe.
Miriam.
Miriam Yun of Woodrow Wilson Center. Thank you for your excellent presentations and explanations. I have two questions. First, although President Clinton was not happy after the President Carter's visit, and he was very reluctant to accept the deal, but anyway, President Clinton accepted the deal and go for the sake of peace. The problem is not President. We don't need another President Carter. We need the President Clinton-like acceptance of the deal. That's the real problem, I think. Is there any chance President Bush change his course and accept deal? That's my first question. My second question is, with the single exception of South Africa, which developed nuclear weapon and then given up, but no other nation has given up a nuclear weapon after they developed. Now, North Korea claimed that they succeeded in detonation of nuclear device. And so I think the prospect is very dismal and bleak that North Korea would give up their nuclear device after their claimed success in nuclear test. Then what will be the objective or the goal of negotiation after that nuclear test? That's my second question. Thank you.
I'll try first. On your second question, will the North Koreans give up the nuclear weapons program now that they've tested? I don't think any of us know. My only answer is, why not go and talk to them and find out? Too many people are simply making the assumption we know the answer. Well, in the past, many times we've made assumptions we knew the answers, and those answers were not the North Korean answers. So I think we really need to be talking with them. You know, I understand where the administration is, and I understand the importance of we only do the six-power talks. Well, put a six-power umbrella over it and have some bilateral talks at the same time, and call it part of the process, the umbrella process. And there's already, I'm sure, when there are talks, I'm sure that Chris Hill and North Koreans go off in the corner and have some conversations. I'm really saying it ought to be on a much more regular basis. It must be a sustained basis, and I would think it ought to be elevated, particularly now that we've had the nuclear test. I think somebody has got to talk to Kim Jong-il. A couple of weeks ago, Jim Mulaney, the ambassador to South Korea at the time of the crisis, the '94 crisis, and I did an op-ed, and we suggested that the person that ought to be sent by the Bush administration for these conversations is former Secretary of State James Baker. I think he would be superb. He's a superb negotiator. He's a brilliant guy. He's done many hard jobs in the past. And he's now, in the last couple of weeks, said that he's been authorized to talk to the Iranians. I think he'd be an excellent person to talk to the North Koreans as well. And he has credibility with the administration. Don, you may want to.
No, but you.
I just realized it's already past our concluding time. The good news, however, is Marion's going to stay with us. So why don't we adjourn at this point, go across the hall, have a bit of refreshment, bit of conversation, buy a book. Marion will sign it, and while he's signing, you can talk to him further. If you will now join me in a round of applause for both our speakers. And of course, as always, thanks to you all for coming as well.